Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Postnatal Minds, the podcast. Today, I am joined by a very special guest and friend, Francesca, and today's episode is going to be based on achondroplasia, which is more commonly known as dwarfism, for a number of reasons. And also the fact that it's Dwarfism Awareness Month in October, and on Friday, which I hope will be the day that this is published, this part 1, is also Dwarfism Awareness Day. And this is the thing that Francesca and I have in common. So we both have beautiful baby boys with achondroplasia. So I'll let Fran introduce. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, Fran, and just let everyone know where you're based, what you do, and how old George is now.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. So, I'm Francesca, and I am based in Tooting in London. And I am mum to beautiful baby boy George, who turned 1 on the 16th, and it's now the 22nd. Forgive my tired mum brain. I can't remember how many days ago that is. Do the math. But yeah, he's very recently 1, and he's just been a joy. And before being mum to George, I worked for a forgotten what I do, commercial real estate company called Knight Frank.
So we met. You explain how we met, because you can explain about the context.
It was one of the really, really positive things about social media. I know people often hear negative sides to social media, but this is one of the things that I'm forever grateful to Instagram. So when I found out George's diagnosis of achondroplasia, Greg, my partner, one of his really, really good friends, very kindly decided to do a big fundraiser for us for the charity Little People, and he ran an incredible distance. He did 10k every day for the month of November, and we were sharing that on socials, on Instagram. And one day, I think about halfway through the challenge, I got a message from the lovely Rosie to say, coincidentally, it was insane, because it's so rare, that Rosie also had a little baby boy with achondroplasia, recently born, not too much older than George, and that Rosie was in a group with a couple of other mums at the time. It's now grown, much bigger, but I think at that time there was only 3 of you in the group, and would I like to join and be part of the crew? And of course I said yes. So that's how we met. The rest, they say, is history.
I remember I was sat around my mum's, and I used to do like sporadic searches of the hashtag achondroplasia on Instagram. I think, I was just in that mode of like finding my village, finding my network, and that's how, as you said, the WhatsApp group grew. And actually at that time there was about 5 of us, wasn't there, of baby boys, all in the southeast. And George and Arlo have 2 months between them, so George is now 12, just turned 1, and Arlo's 14 months. And then there are other babies in our little pack now, and I think it kind of goes across the year. And we've got a crew of mums who have all been an amazing resource at times for many reasons, emotionally and practically. So it's really, I couldn't think of anyone better to be doing the podcast with me today. We joke that Fran's our community OT because she's got like all the gadgets and gizmos, and in helping the babies reach their milestones. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but Arlo's just got this really cool like tummy time scooter thing, thanks to Fran for sharing it. So we appreciate her knowledge and her experience, and we've all kind of got little lead roles in the group that we've just naturally taken a lead on. So that's the introduction. In this part 1, we're going to talk about kind of diagnosis and the experience. We're going to cover some facts on achondroplasia and again our experience in that, and also not forgetting the big mental health journeys that we went through. I've kind of told bits of my story on other parts of the Instagram, and done another couple of podcasts, but I thought it'd be really nice to bring Fran in to kind of join in that conversation. And although we've definitely walked similar pathways in terms of the process, I think some of our experiences were quite different in places. So it's always interesting to have another perspective. So, Fran, do you want to just tell everyone a little bit about the experience you had with George's diagnosis, like the time and what mapped out?
Yeah, so we found out we were pregnant, and very luckily, Greg and I very quickly, we decided that we wanted to have a baby, and miraculously within the first month of trying, we got pregnant, which I was totally shocked about because I was 36 at the time, and everything you read about fertility, men and women's, it literally drops off the face of the curve. So I was thinking it was going to take us a really long time. So I was totally shocked, but a good shocked, so happy.
I remember we were planning this, and you said about the geriatric, and I remember thinking, like,
Yeah.
I still find the word geriatric so weird. Yeah, I mean, there are so many weird words for things, aren't there, just in pregnancy generally, but like looking at you and the word geriatric just really makes me laugh.
Although I feel a lot more geriatric after a year of having a baby.
My back feels like an 80-year-old.
Absolutely. Yeah, so because we were both classed as geriatric sort of parents. And I was very hyper conscious aware of that. And, before pregnancy, I was an anxious person anyway, and I've got a history of depression and anxiety. So I was hyper vigilant throughout pregnancy. And, every tiny little detail, Googling every little thing. And then, almost not trusting the advice. And I remember that Greg and, because I didn't want anything to be wrong with the baby, and I didn't want to do anything, in inverted commas, wrong to harm the baby. And I remember Greg and I planned a baby moon, and it would have been around 16 weeks. So you have your first scan, which is the longest 12-week wait ever, and then the next one was at 20 weeks, but we went on holiday for about 16 weeks. So me and my anxious self, I went and paid for a private scan because I'd convinced myself there was something wrong with the baby, and we got a private scan. And in that scan, actually, it was a really lovely moment. We found out it was a boy. Greg got that on camera, which was so sweet. And yeah, really happy moment. And the scan showing everything was fine. So I paid for that private scan, and then the next scan was the 20-week scan on the NHS. And then they sent us home, and they said everything was fine and happy with your baby. But because of my anxiety and my hypervigilance throughout the pregnancy and checking everything, I went home and read the report. And so when you get a scan for your baby, the measurements are put on a range scale, and as long as the measurements fall within that scale, the sonographers say that your baby's fine and healthy and normal. And I think there's a few other things that they do. They look at the organs and the kidneys and the brain and the heart.
Yeah, fluids and stuff.
Exactly. But I noticed that the head was just on the cusp of being out of range, the biggest range, and his femur was just out of range to be on the smallest range. So I was getting alarm bells in my head. Go onto Google. Anyone who's Googled anything about health will know that is absolutely a worst case scenario, and your brain races a million miles an hour. Achondroplasia was one of the things that it said that it could be, but there was also a whole host of other things, other really scary things as well. And because I'm not a medical professional, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. So the next morning I called the hospital, and it was the lead sonographer, and he told me, stop being silly, stop using Dr. Google, your baby's absolutely fine. He might just be a bit short. Is your partner short? And to be honest, at the time I thought that was a bit of a weird comment, because Greg is 6'1" ish. I'm not short. I wouldn't say I'm tall. I'm 5'4", so that's average height for a woman. I was like, well, neither of us are particularly short, and I was like, And I've got really long legs for my size. So I was like, okay. But because of the way that I guess felt a bit dismissed in that call, and he tried to give me reassurance, the sonographer. I was like, no, listen to the medical professionals.
And we should say at this point that dwarfism isn't actually usually detectable until the 3rd trimester. So, I mean, it obviously is detectable at this stage. I guess some people also might have scans that look like yours and everything then would catch up. I guess we can't say for certain that, but obviously in your case, that was indicative of perhaps what was to come, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, because it's such a rare condition, it's not the first thing that they think of because it is so rare. And actually, a lot of babies do have similar measurements within range and then turn out to be absolutely fine. And then, I had a few other anxious moments throughout the pregnancy with reduced fetal movements when I admitted myself to hospital because I convinced myself the baby wasn't moving, and you get strapped up to that machine and they measure the heart rate and everything's fine, but I didn't get any further scans.
But that's not an unusual thing, because I know you kind of brushed that off then, but, I think lots of people in pregnancies, I certainly did it in both of mine, have that 24 hours of, I haven't had the baby for much. And that really, when you're pregnant, that's the only way you can have that reassurance, isn't it? So, I think that's what you're meant to do. Is what, I'm just validating that. That's a good thing to do, to get checked if you're worried,
Yeah, and they always say that, you'll notice that your baby has a certain pattern. And then, if one tiny thing goes wrong, you're like, oh my gosh, my baby. But yeah, so I checked myself in a couple of times, but he was absolutely fine, but they didn't scan me. So by the time I got to the 36 weeks, I was actually feeling much calmer and much more relaxed by that point because I'd had so much reassurance throughout the pregnancy and every single checkpoint.
Yeah. And that's 16 weeks, isn't it? After, because that last scan was 20 weeks. Because I had a scan at 20 weeks, and they only had me back at 28 weeks because my placenta was covering my cervix. So he was measuring, we didn't know he was a he at that time, but he was measuring fine then. And then it was a 28-week scan, we went back, and that's when it was detected. So if I hadn't had, both the cervix covering my placenta covering my cervix and my blood disorder, which meant I was getting extra scans, like you, I would have had a much longer space. So I kind of, we discovered at 28 weeks diagnosis, and you were 36 weeks, did you say?
Yeah. So 36 weeks.
Yeah, so that's like another 8. Maths is not my strong point, but
yeah.
I'm like, another 12 weeks. I don't know. Yeah, but a longer time. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like, if someone had said to me now, would you rather have just had another 16, getting on with it and thinking things would be fine? I don't know. I don't know if there is a worse or a better. People always say that to me as well, because a lot of people don't find out about until after birth, because it's, as we've just said, you don't get another scan, and it doesn't show up until 3rd trimester. So yeah, I never know if time knowing was a good thing, but we'll come on to that. So yeah, 36 weeks you had your scan, didn't you?
Yeah, so going back to my last point, 36 weeks, I was so much more relaxed. It was a beautiful sunny day, I really remember it. I'm going to our local hospital, and it was a trainee sonographer, and she scanned us, and then the first thing she said was, oh, your baby's in breech. He's in a bit of an awkward position. She said, it's very likely that you'll need a cesarean if he doesn't move, because he is in a very awkward position. And even that, I was hoping for a vaginal birth, but even that, by that point I wasn't stressed. I was like, what will be will be. Let's just, have a happy, healthy baby. And, that kind of saying turns on its head.
You're so near the end then, aren't you? You're just...
Yeah, we had everything bought, and, didn't need anything. The hospital bag was packed. We were good to go. And she just said, "Oh, I'm going to have to get my supervisor in because he's in a really difficult position and I can't get the measurements." I was like, okay. Even that didn't, I still wasn't stressed at that point. Then the doctor sonographer, I don't know if that's the right term, but like the non-trainee sonographer came in, scanned me, and then she said, "Your baby is in an awkward position, but some of the measurements are measuring small." And she's like, "I'm going to have to get a consultant to check this. You're going to have to come back in a couple of hours." That was when my heart kind of sank, and Greg and I just looked at each other, and I questioned that sonographer. I was like, "Is everything okay?" And she was like, "I can't." She's like, "Everything looks okay in terms of, I think, the heart and the organs." And she says, "That's all fine, you know." And and they scan the brain as well. And she's like, that all looks fine. She was like, "He's just in an awkward position." She's like, "I can't tell you anything, but we just need to make sure."
And of course, you've spent your pregnancy feeling quite anxious, and let's not beat around the bush. Pregnancy is an anxiety provoking time. You can be the most laid back person in the world, and you're going to have moments in your pregnancy where you worry. And now you're in this position where actually, you know, all of your anxieties are coming true. And I bet that was like the longest 2 hours of your life waiting for that to go back and see the consultant. Because I know ours came in straight.
Yeah.
In fact, I think ours was even in the room at the time, I think. But you had this 2 hour wait.
Yeah. And just picking up on what you've said as well, like me and my anxious brain, and, you know, and I'm sure a lot of other people can relate. Greg and I went for a really long walk around the park, and Greg Googled, and I was like, "I'm not going to Google because I'm queen of catastrophizing, queen of worst case scenario." And I was just like, I don't want to worry when I'm this pregnant, this close to having a baby, if actually everything is fine and I've just had the most stressful few hours of my life. And there was also a part of me that was thinking, if I don't Google, if I don't look at it, then it's not happening. And it was almost just a bit like a denial that, oh yeah, we're just going to go back and he was in a difficult position and then everything's going to be okay and then we can just relax. And I was kind of like hanging on to that
thread,
I guess, thread of hope. Yeah. Because it is, yeah, as you know, Rosie, it's just like, you know, your world changes in a split second. So then we go back into the hospital and we get met with bottles of water in the waiting room. And then I know it sounds really silly, but that Greg just looked at me and he was like, "There's something wrong," because like they don't do that on the NHS. We've had enough scans and we've had enough checkups here to know that if they do something like that, then they know that something's wrong. So then, like, you know, the heart's going pumping. And then we get called in by the consultant and we get placed into this other scan room, and there was about like 5 other people in the room. None of them really introduced themselves. And then they just start scanning, and I couldn't see the screen or their faces because of how I was laid down and how they needed to scan me. But Greg could see, and I could see Greg's face, and I could just see Greg's face sort of dropping and then reading out the measurements. In the meantime, the sonographer, she was being quite rough with me because he was in a difficult position, and she kept having to, for anyone that has ever been scanned, sometimes they really do push into your tummy with the little scanning thing, I don't know what it's called. And she was, you know, like manipulating my belly, and then they were just calling out measurements. And then Greg said to me, he's like, "I know there's something wrong," because all of the people that were stood there had their hands over their mouths and like dropped faces.
Were you looking at Greg at this point? Because I remembered I knew something was wrong, and I was looking at Lloyd, and I remember thinking, I actually can't look anywhere else right now. I guess in such an unfamiliar and unnatural scenario, that's your only familiarity and your only safe person, isn't it? Because it is like an out of body experience.
Such an out of body experience, and you're looking to, like, as you said, your partner your familiarity, your safe place for reassurance, and they can't give it to you. And then when you can see the look on their face, you know, because it's usually the men in these situations are a bit more measured, but when they start to worry, you know, that's when you're like, oh gosh, something is happening here. And then, yeah, Greg just blurted out. He didn't wait for them to say anything. He was just like, is something wrong? Is everything okay? Just tell us. And then we got delivered it in the most not nice way. She just turned around and just went, short. Your baby's short. It's got achondroplasia. And we were like, what? What? And they were like, short. Your baby will be short. And we were like, but what was that other word you said? Achondroplasia. And like, we'd never heard of that. So we were like, I couldn't really comprehend what she was trying to say, what she was meaning. And she was like, and then eventually I think she said dwarfism. And we were like, gosh, because we didn't know anyone dwarfism, you know.
Well, yeah,
have no idea about it.
And you haven't really, it's not a word you hear a lot of, because I had a similar reaction.
No.
We thankfully had a bit of a better delivery than that in the way that the consultant, and I remember him saying like, oh, a number of things in the scan, blah, 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 and my head, and then he said the word lead me to diagnosis of achondroplasia, and I, like you, remember saying to him, what I remember feeling like a pang of like anger of like, why are you saying a word to me that you know I'm not going to know? And I remember just saying, what is that? What is it? What is it? And I remember in my state, and then he said it's more commonly known as dwarfism, and yeah, I just remember the whole room closing in, and you almost can't speak. Like you said, your heart's racing. I can feel it again now. I'm talking about it now. Whenever I talk about this moment, I don't know about you, but this is the point that I think back to all the time. And I'm trying, not all the time, but like when I think back to the worst part of this whole process for me, it's that moment where this is fed to you at a time where you're, you know, at the end of your pregnancy, nearly gone through the worst of it, and then this unimaginable news is delivered to you. And not only that, you've had it delivered in a way that's like completely inhumane.
Yeah, as you said before, like the out of body experience, walls closing in on you. It's like you get like this, like a ringing in your ear, like, you know, everything just goes a bit fuzzy. And then I don't know about you, how you felt in that moment, but then I just felt really like detached from myself in the pregnancy then, because, you know, because everyone, oh, do you want a boy or a girl, you know, those things. And I was like, I don't care as long as it's healthy.
Yeah, me too.
And then at that moment, my baby's not healthy, and I'm like healthy in inverted commas, you know, as I was led to believe at that time. And I felt a bit of a detachment from myself, from my body, from my pregnancy. And I was like, I'm carrying this baby, this being.
I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know if I can cope with it. I don't know what the condition means. I don't know what that means for the baby.
Choice.
I don't know what it
because it's happening and you don't have a choice. And we didn't actually know at that point if we were having a boy or a girl, because we wanted a surprise. And then we later found out that we decided to find out because we thought it would help us envisage a lot more kind of the journey ahead. And I look back now and feel quite sad about that moment not being one that was how I had envisaged as well, because, you know, finding out Alba was a girl at birth was amazing because everyone was convinced she was a boy, and then this girl came out and it was a really lovely surprise, and I was so sure that's what I wanted to do again. And then we found out later on, just before the amniocentesis, that we were having a boy, and Lloyd actually walked out of the room crying, and it was a really hard moment. It was really emotional, and it wasn't until, you know, it was almost like we hadn't even processed the fact we were having a boy, because we had this huge piece of news, and then it was only days or weeks later that we were like, oh my God, we're having a boy. We can actually think about this now, like how lucky we've got one of each. But it was like that whole experience was like so because it was nothing we'd planned, but it suddenly became reality. It was like really, it's really hard to put into words, actually.
Well, I think, I'm just assuming that, that finding out the sex was just trying to regain a little bit of control for you guys, that, of the situation that was happening.
Yeah, I'd never really thought about it like that, but yeah, that probably was at that time the only thing that we could kind of claw back and try and kind of level our minds with again. Yeah.
Yeah. Take a bit of ownership back on the situation. Yeah, and then I think once we got, I'm just recalling, and then once they said that, they put us into one of those family rooms, which, if anyone's ever been into it, they are awful. They're supposed to. It was just like this tiny little box room with a table, a couple of plastic NHS chairs, and then they dumped a box of tissues in the middle, and then they said, "We'll come back in a minute." That minute was half an hour, and they came back and said, "Really sorry, we don't have any information on achondroplasia here, but here's a leaflet we've printed out from Great Ormond Street." And it was a like A4 piece of paper, black and white, one-sided, from Great Ormond Street. And then she's like, "I'll give you some time," and left the room again. And we were just, it was so weird. But when we stepped into that room, it was then that Greg made the point. He was like, "You knew." He's like, "You knew at 20 weeks. You told them and they dismissed you." Because when I Googled it, I said before, achondroplasia things, and then everything. And then at that moment, instead of feeling, I don't know, any other emotion, I just started to feel anger at them for dismissing me, dismissing my concerns at the time, and robbing me of the experience that at that point you just want to be nesting, and you just want to be having, going for brunches, and doing the nursery, and getting your nails done, and all that kind of stuff. And that was just taken away from me.
And do you think that, like you were just saying to me, do you think that was just going into first gear, that was the only thing you could channel whatever you were feeling into then? Well, this is because you almost do that, don't you? Think, right, is this treatable? Can we make this stop? So I remember that being one of the first questions I had for the geneticist a few days later. Is there any vitamins or anything I can take to help his bones grow, or like treatments? You have all those conversations, don't you? But yeah, do you think that anger was just like the easiest? I mean, it's also a part of grief, isn't it? So that the cycles of grief are real, and you're grieving the journey and the baby, the healthy baby you thought you were going to have. But yeah, I guess it was a natural thing for you at that point.
Yeah, I was just it was just anger, and then a bit about what you were saying. I just felt like so out of control in that situation, and just your world is just like what. And in grief, you're so right, because you when you get pregnant and you have a baby, like, you envision what your life's going to be when the baby gets here in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time. That is gone. It's taken away from you, and you have to come to terms with that. And we had very little time to do that. And then it's not a choice that you're making. For us, getting pregnant and having a baby was a very proactive, wanted choice.
It's that classic thing of, you think you're going to have a pregnancy. Yes, you might have anxieties. Yes, you might have worries, but everything will be okay in the end. And it's that, like, you never think things like this are going to happen to you, as cliche as it sounds. I remember feeling like you don't want to go anywhere, but someone's thrown you on a train, shut the door, and you're going to that destination whether you like it or not. At that point, that's how it felt. I wanted to run away, but I can't run away because this baby's inside me and I'm growing it. And I remember this really funny moment where we were in a room like that with you, and I realised in my dwarfed mental state at that time that I needed a wee, and there was a toilet in the room, and I remember just being like, do I go for a wee? How can I just go for a wee when all this is going on? Like, and I remember sitting and having a wee, and everything, my brain was like running around, and how can I just be doing something so normal when things aren't normal? And it was just like that yeah, like you said, they said to us, we'll come back in 20 minutes. And I mean, that felt like 1 minute to us. And as I said before, he was really lovely, and he did sit down and answer any kind of immediate questions and offer kind of what reassurance they could before we had the amniocentesis. But yeah, I can't imagine how you felt having it delivered like that and not having any information or any kind of reassurance. It must have felt very isolating and scary.
Well, because when you're in that state of shock, you're not, reading and taking in a leaflet. It's not really something that you're capable of doing.
No.
Then when they eventually came back, they offered for us to speak to the geneticist, which we did. And then at that point in my pregnancy, because I was so traumatized by what happened, I developed tocophobia, which is a phobia of having a baby and giving birth. And talking to my brother, who happens to be a family therapist and has dealt with it before. So when he was talking me through this, he was listening to me speak and everything, and he was like, "You've got this condition." But he didn't tell me that until I think 4 days before we had George. So like during this whole period, I didn't realise that, but it was the trauma of that diagnosis that took me into that phobia. So we spoke to the geneticist, and then she didn't really give too much information to us, because I think she could just see that both of us were in just a bit of a shock trauma state, and we weren't really taking in any information. So she said, "We think it's achondroplasia." And I was just like, well, you think or because, this is quite important. Like, we need what is wrong with my baby. Like, I want to know what's wrong with my baby. She said, well, we think it's achondroplasia, but we can't be certain. And the only way that we can tell is if you have the amniocentesis, like you. She was like, do you want it? Because it's an invasive procedure. So for anyone who doesn't know what an amnio is, which I didn't before I had one, it's where they stick a needle into your tummy and extract some of the amniotic fluid. And within that, it contains a lot of DNA and genetic information on the baby, and they can do screening for all sorts of things on that. But it also comes with a risk. You can go into labour at that. It can induce labour or
and they are not nice things to have done. Before we travelled up to London to have the same scan you've been describing, I remember one of the midwives there saying, you might need to have this done. I remember being like, it's going to be fine. Right. I don't know why she's saying that, because it's going to be fine. I was so like, yeah, I was so convinced everything would be fine. And I remember her saying it doesn't hurt, because they don't use anaesthetic because the needle's so thin and long, isn't it? But I mean, sorry if anyone's gonna need one in their pregnancy that might be listening to this, but they are not nice things to have done. They are stingy, and I mean, I was quite like you. I was quite detached at that point, and I was just like, yeah, that's fine, whatever, we'll have it done. And lying on the bed being like, well, like right now nothing can get worse, so just get it done. But now I look back, I was like, God, that was actually quite painful, and I think I was quite numb to it at that point.
Yeah, but I was like you. I was just, because I just needed answers. I needed to get control back. I needed to understand what we were dealing with.
Yeah, until I saw it on paper, I still wasn't really willing to accept it, because I didn't trust. I'd had other failings in my care. I didn't want to. I didn't really trust anyone. And when I had Alba, they'd said she had small femur bones as well, and we had to go back for an extra scan. She was fine, so I was still like, I think they might have still got it wrong. I've got quite a big forehead. I was still trying to desperately grasp at ways that it couldn't be. I remember when we saw the geneticist, honestly, I don't know if you got this, they took the family tree, and she said, anyone in the family got a big forehead? And I was like, yeah, me. I got bullied all the time when I was at school for having a big forehead. And she actually got a tape measure out and measured my forehead. I was like, yeah. She measured my forehead, and she was like, you don't have a big forehead. And I was like, oh, right, well, that's a bit of therapy for me then, because I've lived my whole childhood thinking I had a really big forehead, then it stuck out loads. But at the same time, I was like, this is the first time in my life I want to have a big forehead, because I want you to be wrong, and I want that to be the reason why my baby's head's measuring large. But yeah, it's funny, those moments you think of now, but Yeah. So you have to have the amniocentesis to confirm it genetically, and they take a couple of weeks to come back, which is a really long wait. I remember calling them quite a lot and being like, is it back yet? I think they knew me, but they must have had a red mark by my name by that point. But we actually got a call to say, this is one of the things in our pregnancy that didn't go great, but we actually had a call to say that the amniocentesis results were all negative and that our baby didn't have achondroplasia. And we literally had like 24 hours where we were like, so look, I remember calling like my mother-in-law and being like, it's a mistake. And they were all like, what? Because they couldn't believe we'd been put through what we'd put through if it wasn't. And and then they called back the next day to say, oh no, the blood sample wasn't back, and I think there'd been a contamination of my blood when they did the amniocentesis, so I had to go in and get a blood sample couriered up to London, and it was just that just added to the stress of it all. But yeah, until I saw it, I remember the day, I don't know about you, but the day that the results came back in an email, and they did phone as well. That's the day that I started to accept, okay, this is happening. And it was quite a dark day for me. I spent a lot of that day crying. I didn't want to talk to anyone. And I was just like, okay, this is happening. I just let everyone know, yep, it's back and he's got it. And I remember that being like quite a dark day in the timeline.
Yeah, it's so tough, isn't it? Our amnio, it wasn't straightforward because I asked for pain relief and they said no. And then I ended up having a panic attack on the table whilst they were doing it, so they had to stop because they couldn't get anything out, and I was just so stressed. And then they were like, oh, don't worry, you don't need the amnio, we can get the results from bloods. Do you want your bloods taken? I was like, yeah, but why did you put me through the amnio if you get it through bloods? So then I calmed down and they did blood sample, and then we went home, and then I got a call at 8 o'clock the next morning from the geneticist, and she was like, oh, they didn't take enough blood, you're going to have to come back in. And I just remember saying, is this a joke? I was like, no, it's not a joke. And I was like, why didn't you do it properly yesterday? And she was like, I can't answer that. If you want the results, you're going to have to come back in. So I was like, oh my God, for God's sake. So then marched straight back into the hospital, got there to do the bloods. And then she was like, you do realise that the bloods won't tell you what you need to know. You have to have an amnio. And I was like, did they
just
do
like
it yesterday?
reliving trauma in that environment, and again like that constant flow of uncertain information. Like when something like this happens to you, you need someone to be like, this is happening, it's going to be okay, this is what happens next, this is your choice, this isn't like, this is the information. Like you need someone to pick you up and mother you through that whole experience. Like there's definitely some training that needs to go on. And again, I cannot imagine what that was like.
So then I had to go again to have the amnio. I didn't have a panic attack this time, but they managed to get enough of the fluids out. But because of all of the muddle and just the way that we'd been treated and how the news had been delivered to us and all sorts of reasons, when I was talking to my family about, what we were going through, my older sister, who was actually my guardian angel at this point, said to me, look, you don't need to give birth at this hospital if you keep getting traumatized going back in. And I was like, don't I? And she was like, no, you can switch. And I was like, please can I switch? So then that made me feel so much better. So she went with me, and we managed to switch to King's Hospital, and then I registered, and then I had to go in for my booking appointment. Obviously at 38 weeks pregnant by this point.
So before you got to that point, Fran, because we had that scan that you had at 36 weeks and that experience with the amnio, after the scan, we went back up to London to fetal medicine unit 3 days later and met with the geneticist. We took my mum along, which I remember being such a good idea now because it was another mind to absorb all the information. But they said to us, bring questions, anything you want. I think we met one of the other geneticists up there as well. And Lloyd and I and my mum went up, and we had my little notebook full of questions from, can I take extra vitamins, to, whatever questions we all had. We got them from all the family as well. Did you have that time before before you started then progressing into like the birth side of things?
That time was given to us when she delivered the news and told us that we needed the amnio. So we didn't.
You didn't have proper time
It
to
was
think about what you might want to
no.
ask then.
Yes, that was our hour after our initial diagnosis from the scan. But we did have her email, and she was emailing us. But to be like, we were both in such a state, and we weren't. We were in shock and trauma.
Yeah, I don't think I'd have remembered anything that day. I remember saying to Lloyd, she would just get a taxi home, because I couldn't even face getting on the train from London back to Brighton. I was like, I didn't want this to become a reality in any other way. I wanted to leave that building. But just going back to when we met the geneticist, and that was the point that we were given quite a lot of practical information about the condition that we obviously know now. And I just wonder if this is a good point to just run through some of those things. You know, a lot of the questions about why, how has this happened? We only thought that this could happen to people who had dwarfism in the family. And actually that's a question, isn't it, that we get asked all the time. Was it in the family when they meet our babies now? So babies with achondroplasia 80% of the time have average height parents, and it's a genetic mutation of the FGFR3 gene. F3, yeah. And it's a sporadic mutation preconception. I remember that her explaining it to me, like, if you're a visual person, it's the analogy of someone putting a brake on the gene that enables bone growth. So someone putting a big brake on it and slowing it right down. I remember that helping me to understand it, because it can get quite complex. So our babies will have small limbs, normal sized torso. I don't know if you can remember any of the other facts.
Yeah, so she said it to us like it is spelling mistake. Every person has a spelling mistake in their genes. It just so happens that these spelling mistakes land on that gene. So some of the other facts, they said that people with dwarfism have average life expectancy and average intelligence, and that their cognitive abilities aren't affected. It's just mainly a physical disability.
I remember, Fran, the consultant saying to me, and I feel like this is the only way I could probably fault them that day, as he said to me, you are having a perfectly healthy baby. Neurologically, health-wise, they will be fine. They will just be small. And only now, having sat through a million zillion appointments and being under respiratory and having the sleep apnea diagnosis, which we'll talk about episode 2, they can have some health impacts due to their delayed bone growth, can't they?
Yeah, and George had to have an operation at 6 months old, so he's a good example of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I really remember, but I wasn't ready to hear it at the time, was the geneticist saying that a lot of the children or people with achondroplasia or dwarfism, she was like, they all have really strong special characters, and she was like, you're going to have someone special. She was like, it's a gift, which now that I think about that now, of course I do, and from the moment he was born I felt like that, but like at that time, at that point, I couldn't feel that, I couldn't hear it, and
you're so far from that feeling.
It's really, this whole process is really confronting on what the word healthy baby and like your preconceived ideas, biases, beliefs of what that means. I know that it's really changed my view on that, and for the better. But yeah, at that particular time, I just couldn't hear it. And everyone, like you, Rosie, they were reassuring me cognitively, they were fine, as conditions go, they were like, you will be fine. They live normal, happy lives. And like they said to you, they'll just be small, short. So yeah, that was the facts that I remember. Obviously, I've learned a lot more about the condition since George has been born.
Yeah, I mean, you have to become experts by experience in a short amount of time, and then each of our journeys has been slightly different. But as we said earlier, having that group now, that pool of knowledge, of experience to pull upon. I think one of the only other things we had was a meeting with the Evelina, where their care is led before he was born, and they just explained about the holding position. So our babies were born with gibbous in their back, like a kyphosis curved spine, and actually you can do a lot to prevent this from getting worse by laying them flat. So, you know, other babies might be in slings or the little bouncer chairs. Our babies can't do that. Anything that kind of puts their spine into a natural C shape. They can't have long periods in car seats, and that can impact their breathing because they have small chests and smaller lungs and breathing capacity. One of their features is that they have a flattened nose. So this part of your nose at the top here is flatter, so they have less space. So if they get a cold, for example, these months are always most worrying for us. Arlo's got one at the moment. He's struggling with his snot and his coughing, but those things are a lot harder for them because they just have less space in their ear, nose and throat system. Yeah. So and as Fran said earlier, they will reach their milestones. They will just do it in a lot more of a delayed way. So as I said earlier, Arlo's 14 months old now, and he's not sitting yet. In fact, he's, in my opinion, nowhere near. He's building strength and he's rolling, and George is pulling up, isn't he, to kind of standing on things, and has great. They find it hard to lift their heads up, but they will get there just in their own time. I think they're the kind of main facts that you get before birth and before experience, and the main things really at that point of diagnosis that you have to kind of wrap your head around pretty quickly, isn't it?
Yeah, because, you know, your baby's going to be here and you need to know what to do with them that's different to other babies, which is actually quite a lot.
Yeah.
We actually had to get rid of some of the baby stuff. Luckily, John Lewis, they were very gracious and let us return stuff that was well out of the return date.
That's nice.
And we just swapped it. And then, I remember as well, we had to buy last minute car seat purchase because I can't go in regular car seats, and we had to buy a lie flat car seat to get the baby home, and we literally had 3 days to do that. Thank God for Amazon. Thank God that Amazon had. I think there was literally one in stock.
You had those appointments, you went into your booking appointment in the other hospital. Obviously, it's only been a couple of weeks since you had this news. You know you're having a C-section. How did that all go for you from there?
Yeah, so Greg and I were expecting to go in, do the standard booking appointment, which takes about an hour, and then go home, and then get the date for our C-section. I needed a C-section because not only was he breech transverse back to back, but most achon babies, because they've got larger heads, very difficult to come out vaginally. So, but I think in my case with his position, it was near on impossible. So I wanted a C-section. And then as I was telling the doctor what I'd been through, how I was feeling, admitted me for my mental health. So I got put into a mum and baby ward, and for anyone who's ever been on those wards, you can't actually leave voluntarily because they lock the doors. I did not have permission to leave. Greg couldn't even go and get a coffee. I wasn't allowed to be on my own. I was on one-on-one man marking
observation.
So I had a nurse outside.
Yeah. I remember those days on the wards. So what was going through your mind at that point? Because they must have been pretty worried about you. And obviously you're with Greg and he knows you, and you've got the context of having been through something, you know, very big, and you're about to take on something that's also very big. What's kind of going through your mind at that point?
At that point, I was actually starting to turn a corner in terms of my mental health. The acceptance was coming, and, you know, I just wanted to have my baby, and I just wanted to meet George and see him because we'd been through so much. And when I was telling the new hospital, and they were obviously concerned about postpartum depression and everything else, they wanted to ensure that all three of us got the support that we needed. And in order to get that support via the NHS, this was the pathway that we had to go down, which was to be it because the threshold for the support that we would have needed once George was here, you have to be admitted to get that level of support when you get discharged back into the community. when I was admitted, you know, I didn't even have a toothbrush or a change of knickers. I literally just had my handbag, phone and wallet. Like, Greg didn't have anything. We had to share a hospital bed to sleep in. And I really didn't want to stay. I was, you know, 38 weeks pregnant. I just wanted to go home and sleep in my own bed. And the lead psychologist is like, look, we don't want you to discharge yourself. You are here, like, voluntarily, in quotation marks. I wasn't sectioned or anything like that. But,
Informally.
like, they were, yeah, but they were just like, don't leave. And he said, we really want you to stay. And if you stay whilst you're admitted here, when baby comes, you'll get the support that you'll need. So eventually, because I was really protesting to staying because I just wanted to sleep in my bed. But yeah, eventually I conceded and then, you know, stayed the night. And then the next morning they said, oh, you can have your baby tomorrow if you want. And I was like, yeah, cool. But you need to let me go home and get all my stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I was like, I haven't even got clean pair of clothes or a toothbrush. I was like, let alone anything for the baby. I was like, you need to let me leave the hospital. And they were like, all right, yeah, okay, we'll let you leave, like, to come back. And then by the time they came back on the rounds, they were like, actually, we haven't got a slot for you Friday, but we'll do your C-section on Monday, but we'll discharge you today. So then, you know, at least Greg and I had the weekend. And actually that weekend was kind of like the first time that we, I think, felt okay. You know, we were both back on the same page. We had acceptance. We'd been watching a lot of this American comedian called Brad Williams, who's got dwarfism. He's actually quite funny, and that really helped us through the diagnosis. We watched lots of YouTube videos. Greg's mum put us in contact with the charity Little People, and I've made a couple of connections that, you know, spoke to a couple of mums who, you know, who've got older children with dwarfism. So we'd had that support, and yeah, I was just feeling better about it. And then on the day of our C-section, they were consenting us for the terms and conditions of the C-section, and she was like, oh, it's a really small chance, but you've got a 1 in 12,000 chance of death from the C-section. And I was like, what? 1 in 12,000? She's like, it's really low, so it won't happen. But in my head, I was like, well, there was a 1 in 25,000 chance that George was going to have dwarfism. So I convinced myself I was going to die.
Yeah, we hadn't actually, that's like the big stat, and we haven't actually mentioned that yet in this episode. That, yeah, I mean, it varies, doesn't it? 1 in 35,000 or 1 in 25,000 is 25,000 is kind of more common, is the chance.
And then, yeah, so cue another panic attack on the operating table. And so they gave me the spinal block. Yeah, I was in full panic attack. She was like, you need to calm down. Gave me gas and air. After the gas and air, I was absolutely fine. Then I had to have a second spinal block because the first one didn't work. So I was absolutely high as a kite. And I know lots of people say that they can feel, it feels like having the washing up or pulling and prodding in the C-section, but I felt absolutely nothing because I'd had two blocks and gas and air.
I mean, I've had 2 C-sections, and my C-section with Arlo was, and this always really confuses me as well, because I had that condition, which you can also, is really common with achondroplasia, and I can't remember the name for it now clinically because I'm too tired in my brain, but where you have extra fluid, you have extra amniotic fluid. So my tummy was very big, and I was a bit like, why is it so hard to get him out? Because they were always describing the risks of going into natural labour because they're floating in loads of water, because they're smaller and they can get tangled and they can be quick births, etc. But like, why are you struggling so much to get him out if he's so small? Because I really did feel the pull, and I remember being like, oh, like really feeling it. So that's funny that the gas and air was obviously doing its trick.
Yeah, it was. And then I just heard a little squeak, and I kind of thought that was in like my high state. And then they were like, did you hear that? And I was like, oh. And then I just heard George cry, and that's your baby. And I was like, oh my God. And then literally like everything melted away for me at that moment. But then they took him off to clean him and like measure him. And I was like, where's my baby? And I just wanted my baby.
You don't know what your baby's going to look like anyway. And then you've got this condition where you've never seen a baby with this condition before. And then there is a little bit, for me anyway, there's a little bit of fear there of what was going to be held up above that curtain. And obviously we know we didn't need to worry now. In fact, when they're newborn, it's probably the one time that you can't see their condition at all. So they look long and gangly when they're newborn. I look back now, I was really trying to see it and I couldn't see it then. In true live motherhood style, I've lost Fran because poor George is not very well and he's woken and he needs her and she needs to be with him. So, I mean, this part of the episode was naturally coming to an end because I think we'd kind of said about the births and both having C-sections and the babies arriving, and of course that alleviating a lot of the anxiety and stress that we were experiencing at that time. That's absolutely not to say that our emotional and mental health journeys within that stopped at that time, because they didn't. You know, everyone who's had a baby will know that the fourth trimester is one, if not the most hardest part of a pregnancy with the hormones, let alone still trying to kind of accept this diagnosis you've been given, the fact that it's happened to you and your child, and you've had to learn about it quickly. Amongst the total love and happiness is fear and anger and a lack of acceptance, to be honest. And, you know, for Fran and some of the other girls that have got babies in our position, they, you know, are first time mums, so they're navigating all of that. It's less familiar. So yeah, we still had a lot of worries, I think, was how I was going to kind of conclude. A lot of worries, a lot of fears. There's a beautiful poem called Welcome to Holland, which is really lovely if you Google it. And it really just talks about that grieving journey, how you are on a different path, but believe me, that path will be beautiful too. There were a lot of tears in that time, but yeah, nothing stops that birth moment, particularly with a calm C-section being amazing. And I think it's important to highlight that a lot of our friends who have had babies with achondroplasia haven't had a plain sailing experience, in terms of a lot of the people that we know have had to spend some time in ITU or HDU. So again, having more challenges around the baby's breathing and monitoring because of their vulnerabilities with their breathing and their lungs. So although we've had, you know, babies with the same condition, it can really vary in terms of their health thereafter. And Fran and I were both lucky in that George or Arlo didn't need to spend any extra time in hospital. I did spend 3 nights in hospital though, due to his breathing, and they just needed to check him over to make sure that he didn't have the same blood condition I had. And I unfortunately had to have more transfusions post-birth because I've got a rare blood disorder as well. But that's not to say that that time wasn't needed anyway, because as all of you will know that have had children, when you get back home, it hits different. So join us next time for part 2, where we are going to talk more about the first year of the boys' lives and what their care looks like and what their monitoring was look like, some of the things they've had to go through already, including admission to hospital, and George had to have an operation, as Fran alluded to earlier, and some more facts and figures about achondroplasia. Any questions, please throw them our way. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you for listening, and we will see you soon for part 2. Bye.